USS Midway, Pacific Ocean, April 1951. Lieutenant Commander James Thatch watches from the carrier's island as yet another Grumman F9F Panther screams toward the deck at 120 knots. The jet fighter, sleek and powerful, represents the future of naval aviation. It also represents a killing machine that's murdering more pilots during landing than in combat. The Panther crosses the ramp. Too high. The pilot realizes his error and shoves the throttle forward, but jet engines don't respond like piston engines. There's a delay, a fatal hesitation in thrust delivery that leaves the aircraft hanging in the air for 2 agonizing seconds. The jet drops. The main landing gear catches the edge of the deck with a sound like a gunshot. The nose gear collapses. The aircraft cartwheels forward in a shower of sparks and shearing metal, tumbling across the deck before careening over the port side into the Pacific. The plane guard destroyer races toward the impact point. Thatch doesn't wait for the report. He already knows. The pilot never had a chance to eject. That makes 7 jets lost in 3 weeks. 4 pilots dead. The Navy's transition to jet-powered carrier aviation, supposed to cement American naval dominance for decades, is instead producing casualty rates that make admirals question whether jets belong on carriers at all. The mathematics tell a story of escalating crisis. During World War II, carrier landing accidents killed approximately 1.2 pilots per 10,000 landings. Dangerous, but acceptable given the demands of combat operations. By 1951, with the introduction of jet fighters, that rate explodes to 6.8 deaths per 10,000 landings. Nearly 6 times deadlier. At current rates, a jet pilot assigned to carrier duty has a 23% chance of dying in a landing accident before completing a standard tour. That's not combat. That's just coming home. Senior commanders gather in emergency conferences from San Diego to Washington. The jet age promised revolutionary capability, fighters fast enough to intercept Soviet bombers, powerful enough to carry nuclear weapons, advanced enough to dominate any adversary. But those advantages mean nothing if the aircraft can't land on a carrier without killing their pilots. Some admirals quietly suggest abandoning carrier-based jets entirely, returning to propeller-driven aircraft until the landing problem can be solved. Others propose constructing larger carriers with longer decks, a solution that would take years and billions of dollars. What none of them know is that at that very moment, a British Royal Navy officer with an engineering degree and a talent for questioning assumptions is sketching diagrams that violate every principle of carrier landing technique developed over 40 years of naval aviation. A method so counterintuitive that American test pilots will initially refuse to attempt it. A method that flight instructors will call suicidal. A method that will reduce carrier landing accidents by 80% and save thousands of lives over the next 7 decades. To understand why Lieutenant Commander H.C.N. Goodhart's innovation proved so revolutionary, you must first understand why jet aircraft transformed carrier landings from difficult to nearly impossible. Propeller-driven fighters like the F6F Hellcat or F4U Corsair approach a carrier deck at roughly 85 knots. Their piston engines provide immediate throttle response. When a pilot realizes he's low on approach and needs more altitude, he advances the throttle and the engine responds instantly. The propeller changes pitch, generating immediate thrust. The aircraft climbs. Pilots call this flying the ball, constantly making tiny throttle adjustments to stay on the proper glide slope, indicated by the Fresnel lens optical landing system that shows whether they're high, low, or perfectly centered. This technique, refined through thousands of carrier landings during the Second World War, depends on one critical assumption: that the aircraft's engine can provide instantaneous power corrections. Jet engines shatter that assumption. The early turbojet engines powering fighters like the Panther, the F-2H Banshee, or Britain's Sea Hawk require 3 to 5 seconds to spool up from idle to full thrust. That delay, called throttle lag, transforms carrier approaches into exercises in predicting the future. A pilot who realizes he's sinking below the glide slope and advances his throttle must wait through an eternity of dropping altitude before the engine develops enough thrust to arrest his descent. By then, it's often too late. The aircraft impacts the ramp, the structure at the carrier's stern that leads up to the landing deck, with predictable catastrophic results. Jet aircraft also land faster. The swept wings and streamlined fuselages that make jets fast in level flight require higher approach speeds to generate sufficient lift. Those extra 30 to 40 knots mean less time to recognize and correct errors, less margin for misjudgment. A propeller fighter approaching at 85 knots covers the final quarter mile in about 10 seconds. A jet at 120 knots covers the same distance in 7 seconds. 30% less time to assess, decide, and react. The physics work against jet pilots in every dimension. Higher speeds, delayed engine response, less controllability at slow speeds, greater momentum making the aircraft harder to maneuver. The traditional technique of flying the ball, making constant power corrections throughout the approach, becomes not just difficult with jets but actively dangerous. Pilots chasing the glide slope with power adjustments find themselves overcorrecting, creating oscillations that amplify rather than dampen. Too low, add power, wait for response, now too high, reduce power, wait for response, now too low again, add power, no time, impact. The accident reports pile up. Experienced pilots, veterans of combat operations, dying on routine training flights. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics commissions studies. Engineers propose solutions. Stronger landing gear to absorb harder impacts. Improved optical landing systems to give pilots better glide slope information. Modified throttle linkages to reduce lag. Each solution addresses symptoms rather than the fundamental problem. Jets and traditional landing techniques are fundamentally incompatible. Lieutenant Commander H.C.N. Goodhart arrives at this crisis from an unusual direction. Born in 1916 in Kent, England, Goodhart studies aeronautical engineering at Cambridge before joining the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm in 1939. He flies combat missions during the Second World War, but his engineering background constantly pulls his attention toward technical problems rather than just executing procedures. After the war, Goodhart serves as a test pilot at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, where the Royal Navy conducts experimental flight testing. His assignment focuses on evaluating Britain's first generation of carrier-based jet fighters, and he personally experiences the terrifying unpredictability of jet carrier landings. He watches friends die. He reviews accident reports. And unlike most pilots who accept danger as an unavoidable cost of military aviation, Goodhart's engineering mind refuses to stop analyzing. During the summer of 1952, Goodhart spends weeks reviewing film from carrier landing accidents. The Royal Navy, like its American counterpart, films every carrier landing for training and accident investigation. Goodhart requisitions footage from dozens of crashes, setting up a film projector in an empty office and watching the same sequences over and over, frame by frame. He notices a pattern. In nearly every jet landing accident, the pilot recognizes a problem, attempts a power correction, and then loses control during the period while waiting for the engine to respond. The aircraft enters what pilots call the region of reversed command, a flight regime where normal control inputs produce counterintuitive results. The pilot's trained instincts, developed through hundreds of successful propeller aircraft landings, actively work against him in a jet. Most observers see this pattern and conclude that jet engines need faster throttle response. Better technology, more sophisticated engine controls, advanced fuel systems. Goodhart sees something different. He realizes the problem isn't the engine's response time. The problem is that pilots are using the throttle at all during the final approach. What if, Goodhart thinks, pilots stopped trying to fly the ball with power corrections? What if instead they stabilized their engine at a constant power setting well before reaching the carrier, and then controlled their glide slope entirely with pitch attitude, using the control stick to adjust the aircraft's angle of attack rather than the throttle to adjust thrust? The idea seems insane. Every carrier landing technique developed over 4 decades emphasizes smooth, minimal control stick movements during approach. Pilots learn to keep the stick nearly motionless, making their corrections with power. Using the stick to chase the glide slope, constantly adjusting pitch, violates fundamental principles. It creates exactly the kind of pilot-induced oscillation that kills people. Except Goodhart realizes that those principles apply to propeller aircraft with responsive engines, not jets with throttle lag. He sketches the concept. A jet on approach would establish a specific power setting, perhaps 85% thrust, at 1 mile from the carrier. The pilot would then leave the throttle untouched and control his descent rate entirely by raising or lowering the nose. Too low on the glide slope? Raise the nose slightly, increasing angle of attack, generating more lift. The aircraft climbs without any change in engine power. Too high? Lower the nose, reducing angle of attack, decreasing lift. The aircraft descends. All corrections happening instantly, controlled directly by the pilot, no waiting for engine response. The technique requires jets to approach at higher angles of attack than propeller aircraft, nearly at the edge of the stall regime. This positioning allows rapid control authority. Small stick movements produce large changes in lift because the aircraft operates near the maximum of its lift curve. It's counterintuitive. It's uncomfortable. It requires pilots to fly their jets in a configuration that feels perpetually on the edge of disaster. Goodhart presents his concept to the Royal Navy's Flying Training Division in October 1952. The response ranges from skeptical to hostile. Senior flight instructors, men with decades of carrier experience, listen to Goodhart's explanation with barely concealed contempt. One commander interrupts. "You're suggesting we teach pilots to fly the approach with the stick rather than the throttle? That's precisely what we train them not to do. That's how you get into pilot-induced oscillation. That's how you crash." Goodhart expects this reaction. He's prepared data, accident analyses, physics calculations demonstrating why traditional techniques fail with jets. But the resistance isn't primarily technical. It's cultural. The Royal Navy's carrier aviation community has spent 40 years perfecting landing techniques. Those techniques represent accumulated wisdom, learned through experience, validated by success. Goodhart, regardless of his engineering credentials, is essentially telling the entire carrier aviation establishment that they're doing it wrong. The criticism intensifies. Your method requires pilots to fly at high angles of attack throughout the approach. One gust of wind, one moment of inattention, and the aircraft stalls. At 200 feet above the water, a stall is fatal. Another instructor adds, "Jet engines may have throttle lag, but at least power corrections are smooth and predictable. Pitch corrections are abrupt. You'll create exactly the oscillations you claim to prevent." Most innovators would retreat at this point, perhaps conduct small-scale tests, gather more data, build consensus gradually. Goodhart does something different. He volunteers to demonstrate the technique himself, flying a Seahawk jet fighter using his proposed method for carrier qualification landings. If it works, the evidence will be undeniable. If it fails, his career effectively ends. The test occurs on November 3, 1952, aboard HMS Eagle in the English Channel. Goodhart briefs the landing signal officer on what to expect. The LSO responsible for waving off unsafe approaches expresses deep concern. "If you stall on final approach, I can't help you. You'll be in the water before I can wave you off." Goodhart launches, climbs to pattern altitude, and sets up for his approach. At 1 mile, He stabilizes his Seahawk at 87% power and doesn't touch the throttle again. The aircraft descends toward the carrier deck. Goodhart watches the optical landing system. He's slightly low. Instead of adding power, he pulls back gently on the stick. The nose rises. The aircraft's descent rate decreases. Now he's centered on the glide slope. A gust of wind pushes him high. He lowers the nose. The descent rate increases. Centered again. The corrections feel abrupt, almost violent compared to the smooth power adjustments of traditional technique. But they're immediate. Every input produces an instant response. No lag, no delay, no guessing where the aircraft will be in 3 seconds. Goodhart crosses the ramp perfectly centered, catches the number 3 arresting wire, and rolls to a stop. He performs 5 more landings. All successful. All using only pitch control during the final approach. The landing signal officer, watching from his platform, sees something he's never witnessed with jets. Consistent, stable approaches without oscillation or hunting. After the 6th landing, the LSO climbs up to Eagle's flight deck and walks directly to Goodhart's aircraft. "I don't know how you did that," the LSO says, "but I've been watching jet approaches for 2 years and I've never seen anything that stable. What exactly were you doing?" Goodhart explains the technique. The LSO listens, processing the implications. "You're essentially flying the aircraft like a glider on approach. Fixed power, adjusting your energy state with pitch." "Exactly," Goodhart confirms. "The engine provides a constant thrust baseline. The pitch attitude determines whether you're gaining or losing altitude within that energy state. It's more intuitive once you stop thinking about power corrections." Word spreads rapidly through the Royal Navy's aviation community. The technique that seemed suicidal produces objectively better results than conventional methods. The Royal Navy begins experimental training programs teaching Goodhart's approach technique to fleet pilots. Initial results confirm the promise. Pilots who master the new method demonstrate dramatically improved landing consistency. More importantly, the accident rate drops. Between January and June 1953, Royal Navy jet squadrons transitioning to Goodhart's technique experience a 63% reduction in landing accidents compared to the previous 6 months. That's not a marginal improvement. That's a transformation in safety. The U.S. Navy, watching developments in British carrier aviation with great interest, dispatches observers to witness the new technique. American test pilots fly demonstration landings aboard HMS Eagle using Goodhart's method. The results convince even skeptics. By late 1953, the U.S. Navy begins incorporating what they now call the constant attitude approach or powered approach technique into carrier landing training. The transition isn't smooth or immediate. Experienced pilots, comfortable with traditional methods, struggle to rewire their instincts. Flight instructors debate the details of implementation. But the statistics become undeniable. Between 1952 and 1955, as Goodhart's technique spreads through American and British carrier aviation, jet landing accidents decrease by 76%. By 1960, incorporating continuous refinements and improvements, the accident rate drops to 1.3 deaths per 10,000 landings. Still dangerous, but approaching the safety levels of propeller aircraft and dramatically better than the crisis years of the early 1950s. The technique evolves and improves over decades. Modern carrier landing procedures incorporate sophisticated variations, angle of attack indexing systems, automated throttle controls. But the fundamental principle remains Goodhart's insight. Stabilize your power and fly your approach with pitch. Don't chase the glide slope with the throttle. The physics of jet engines demand a different technique than propeller aircraft, and refusing to acknowledge that difference kills people. Goodhart's innovation extends beyond carrier aviation. His principle of matching flying technique to aircraft performance characteristics influences jet transport operations, tactical fighter procedures, and ultimately unmanned aerial vehicle recovery systems. The core insight, that new technology sometimes requires abandoning established procedures rather than adapting them, becomes a case study in military aviation training worldwide. H.C.N. Goodhart continues serving in the Royal Navy until 1962, eventually reaching the rank of captain. He never seeks recognition for his innovation. When interviewed later about the development of the powered approach technique, he deflects credit, noting that many pilots and engineers contributed refinements and improvements. But the historical record is clear. One man saw the pattern others missed, developed a solution that contradicted conventional wisdom, and possessed the courage to demonstrate that solution despite intense skepticism. The lesson transcends aviation. Throughout military history, technological advancement frequently outpaces doctrinal adaptation. Armies equipped with machine guns initially employ them using tactics developed for rifles. Navies armed with torpedoes attempt to use them like cannon. New capabilities demand new thinking, but institutional momentum favors incremental modification over fundamental reconceptualization. Goodhart's genius wasn't superior technical knowledge. Naval aviation was full of brilliant engineers and experienced pilots. His genius was the willingness to question whether established methods remained valid when underlying conditions changed fundamentally. That willingness, combined with the competence to develop an alternative and the courage to prove it worked, transformed an impossible problem into a solved one. By the time Goodhart retired in 1962, his technique had become so thoroughly integrated into carrier aviation that most pilots didn't know its origins. Young aviators learning the powered approach in flight school assumed it had always existed, another fundamental procedure passed down through generations. They didn't know that 2 decades earlier, that same procedure was considered suicidal heresy by the establishment. Perhaps that anonymity represents the ultimate success. The best innovations don't remain identified with their creators. They become invisible, absorbed so completely into standard practice that people forget there was ever another way. Goodhart's method doesn't bear his name. It's simply how jet pilots land on carriers, obvious and essential, as if no alternative ever existed. Except alternatives did exist. They just killed people at 6 times the rate of propeller aircraft. Until one pilot refused to accept that death rate as inevitable and had the audacity to propose that perhaps, just perhaps, everyone else was doing it wrong.